A direct flight from Nairobi to Beijing covers about 4,700 miles in 9 hours. The first humans who ever walked that route needed something closer to 3,000 years and a few hundred generations. They had no map. They didn't know China existed. They kept moving because standing still meant running out of food or water. Around 194,000 years ago, a small group of Homo sapiens left a jawbone, several teeth, and stone tools shaped for cutting hide in a cave called Misliya on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Israel. Archaeologist Israel Hershkovitz published the find in 2018. It stands as the oldest solid evidence of our species outside Africa. That trip probably wasn't the only attempt, and it wasn't a one-way success either. Remains at Skul and Kafsa, 2 more sites in Israel, date between 90,000 and 120,000 years old. Groups pushed north, lived there for centuries, then vanished from the record. Ice ages returned. Deserts closed the routes behind them. The people who didn't make it back into Africa likely died along the way. The exit that finally stuck ran south instead of north. Around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, at the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, where the Red Sea narrows to roughly 11 miles, sea levels had dropped low enough to make the crossing survivable. It might have been rafts, floating logs, or strong swimmers pulling children behind them. Nobody knows the exact method. Stone tools, 125,000 years old, found at Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates by geologist Simon Armitage, show people were testing that coastline long before the crossing that finally succeeded. Then Toba erupted. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano on Sumatra exploded with a force no human being has witnessed since. Ash from that eruption turns up in sediment cores as far away as Lake Malawi, more than 4,000 miles from the blast. Some researchers argue it dropped the global human population into the low thousands. Others dispute the number. Whatever the size of the group, the survivors kept walking east. By roughly 65,000 years ago, they reached the edge of Southeast Asia and ran into open water that no amount of wading could cross. Even at the lowest point of the Ice Age, the strait near Timor and the coast of Australia held at least 90 kilometers of ocean. Land wasn't visible from either side. At Majed Bebe, a rock shelter in Australia's Northern Territory, archaeologist Chris Clarkson dated stone axes and grinding tools to that same window, publishing the results in 2017. Someone built a vessel sturdy enough to carry several people and food, then pointed it at open water and started paddling. At Lake Mungo in New South Wales, researchers found a skeleton known as Mungo Man, burned, buried, and covered in ochre, roughly 40,000 years old. Archaeologists call it the oldest known cremation on the planet. Whoever performed that ritual stood several thousand generations removed from the people who left their bones at Misliya Cave. While one branch pushed toward Australia, another turned toward Europe. Homo sapiens reached the Balkans by around 45,000 years ago. Remains found at Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, dated in a 2020 study, place modern humans there alongside Neanderthals, who had already lived on the continent for over 300,000 years. The two groups overlapped for several thousand years. They fought over territory sometimes. They also had children together. Every person today whose ancestry traces outside Africa carries a percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a discovery that earned Svante Pääbo the Nobel Prize in 2022. Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. Modern humans didn't. Further north, the land got harder to survive in, not easier. At the Yana site in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, archaeologist Vladimir Pitulko found mammoth ivory tools and needles with eyes small enough to thread sinew through, dated to roughly 31,600 years ago. Whoever camped there had already solved fitted, layered fur clothing. Exposed skin in that climate fails within hours. That solution mattered because it's what let people survive the stretch that came next. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped by more than 120 meters, and the seafloor between Siberia and Alaska turned into dry grassland, a region researchers now call Beringian. Genetic studies suggest a population lived there, isolated for thousands of years before moving further east. Scientists call it the Beringian standstill. They weren't there by choice. Geography held them in place until ice sheets further east finally opened a gap. Once that gap opened, movement south wasn't a straight walk down the center of the continent. The ice-free corridor through Canada didn't fully open until about 13,000 years ago, and several archaeological sites south of the ice sheets predate that opening. Which points back to boats, a slow crawl down the coast researchers now call the Kelp Highway, harvesting shellfish and seaweed the entire way south. In 2021, a team led by Matthew Bennett published footprints preserved in ancient lakebed mud at White Sands, New Mexico. Radiocarbon dating on seed layers above and below the tracks placed them between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, next to prints from giant ground sloths and mammoths. That's thousands of years before the ice-free corridor existed, which means people were already deep in North America while most of Canada still sat under ice. Further south, at Monte Verde in Chile, archaeologist Tom Dillahay excavated a settlement dated to about 14,500 years old, complete with wooden structures, tools, and chewed plants that still held human saliva markers. For decades, that site contradicted a theory called Clovis First, the claim that one group carrying a specific stone tool style reached the Americas before anyone else. Monte Verde sits roughly 1,000 miles south of where Clovis tools later turn up, and it predates them by centuries. The first arrival theory collapsed once the dates were compared. By the time all of that had happened, humans had already reached nearly every landmass on Earth within range of walking, rafting, or sailing a coastline. A scattering of islands still held no footprint at all. Madagascar was one of them. The island sits only 250 miles off the African coast, yet the people who settled it didn't come from there. Austronesian sailors from Borneo crossed over 4,000 miles of open Indian Ocean and reached the island around 350 CE. The Malagasy language spoken today still traces back to Borneo. The last stop came even later. New Zealand held no human population until Polynesian voyagers, ancestors of the Maori, arrived around 1280 CE, a date confirmed by rat nod seeds carbon dated in New Zealand's own soil. That's within the lifetime of people who were already building cathedrals in Europe. Those voyagers reached the final landmass on Earth large enough to support a population, closing out a journey that started with a jawbone in a cave roughly 200,000 years earlier. Every route mattered on its own terms. The southern crossing near Bab el Mandeb, the gap at Wallace's Line near Australia, the standstill in Beringian, the Kelp Highway down a coastline nobody had charted. Each one solved a specific physical barrier using whatever technology existed at that exact moment, a raft, a needle, or a boat built for open ocean. None of it was guaranteed. Populations went extinct along the way, routes dead-ended, and entire branches of the family tree left nothing behind but a jawbone in a cave. The versions that worked are the reason a plane can now cross in 9 hours what once took 10,000 years, and a willingness to keep walking past the edge of whatever anyone had already seen.